I'd like to acknowledge Australia's First Nation people as the traditional custodians of the land, and for this episode in particular, the Wadandi people. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
Watching the enjoyment of someone come in and look at your wine, taste it, and the big smile that comes on their face is much more important than anything else. Industry recognition's a big part of what we do, but it's not the be-all and end-all.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale.
Trent Kelly has one of those faces. You know, the ones where you feel like you've met him before? I think it's all to do with his open smile and ability to make anyone feel at ease. Trent has over 20 years in the wine industry. He now finds himself at Aravina Estate in Margaret River as their senior winemaker. Hi Trent, thanks for joining me.
Hey Shanteh, thank you for the introduction. I normally don't get those sorts of introductions, so it's quite pleasant hearing that one come through.
I don't believe it. I've already read a few things talking about how you've always got a smile on your face, and it's so true.
Well, we got to try and keep things light and airy, you know, like life's serious enough as it is, and you don't really need to take that into every relationship that you create.
That's for sure. I mean, at least leave it to the second date or, you know, the second time you meet them before you dump a whole load of negativity their way.
Well, that's right. You know, like we live in that serious world of wine and judging and other bits and pieces, you know, you got to have a bit of lightness in your life as well.
Goodness gracious, I totally agree. And maybe that's why we get along well, because we do have that ability to take it all in our stride. Trent, take us back to all, you know, where kind of wine all began for you. What kind of upbringing did you have? And tell us a little bit about when the wine bug hit.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I was born in Perth, but spent the first 5 years of my life in Geraldton, which is north of Perth, probably about 4 hours. My dad ran a crayfishing co-op, so Abrolhos Islands was basically my sort of playground, a lot of chopper flights, a lot of light plane expeditions out there in my early days. And then sort of schooling kicked in and we moved down to Perth to give myself and my sister the opportunity to learn in probably a little bit better environment into city life. But probably the real first interaction with wine that I can probably remember is Mum and Dad bought a holiday house not far from where I'm working now in Yellingup. And that sort of interacted. That was the mid to late 90s. So that was the real first interaction of what sort of down south living is like, but almost wine is the one that created that opportunity for me. So that was the back end of sort of high school. And then as soon as I finished high school, I pretty much moved into Mum and Dad's holiday house and started working within the vines. So that was probably the first real interaction. With regard to consumption, it wasn't probably till a little bit later, you know, like I'm a big beer man, as we all are in the wine industry, you know, it takes a lot of beer to make wine. But it was only really when I started university that I started to get stuck into wine and get a greater understanding of what wine is about.
I'm already kind of, you know, starstruck about, you know, growing up and being able to visit the Abrolhos Islands, because that's a destination that I'm dying to go to one day. So you were very much an outdoorsy person in the fact that you said father in crayfish business and then moving out into, you know, the vineyard. Did you always see yourself as having a career outdoors?
Yeah, 100%. So when I first started uni, everything was angled towards becoming a viticulturalist. It wasn't until I did my first vintage at Darrenberg in 2002 that probably the mindset of wine and what a winemaker can do changed the direction in what I wanted to go in.
Well, it certainly doesn't hurt to have a little bit of interest in viticulture in this wine business anyway. Tell me a little bit about how you decided to go about becoming a winemaker.
So I got accepted into Curtin Uni in their viticultural side of the program, and it wasn't until probably about 18 months into that I had the opportunity, and luckily enough the scores, to change into the double degree, so to do the winemaking side as well. And part of that my alumni were the first to go through the third year program where you went away and did a vintage, so you could pick and choose where you wanted to go in the first half of the year as part of a core part of the curriculum. So that was the definitive sort of moment for me. Going to Darrenburg, I had some friends in South Australia that were working over there, and they said, "I'll come over and have a bit of a look." And I haven't really looked back since. It was probably one of the hardest vintages I've ever done, but also probably one of the most memorable.
And when you say hard, was that just because everything was so new?
Not necessarily, just physically. I'm not sure if you know Darrenburg. At that stage there was a lot of basket pressing. It was a very, very manual job, so not only mentally demanding but physically demanding. And someone that's grown up in a high level of sport, something physically demanding in your early 20s, you just thrive on it. And that sort of created that path and that excitement for what created inevitably my career path.
And then in terms of you having more experience, you did travel overseas. Was that after your South Australian experience or did that come later?
No, so that was quite a bit later. So I spent a fair bit of time within Margaret River, sort of honing the craft outside of vintage. I think from my personal experience, vintage is great, but I think you get to understand wine in a greater aspect when you're actually sitting in a cellar for the rest of the year and getting understanding of the interaction from grape to bottle. So I sort of honed the skill a little bit there, and it wasn't till probably, mid to late 20s where I got an opportunity to spend some time in Canada, in Ontario, with a new wine company called Hidden Bench. So I spent their first vintage with them creating wines under a guy called Jean-Martin Bouchard. So he grew up in Quebec, was trained in Australia in winemaking at Wagga, and his wife was actually an Australian based in Perth. And we talk about a level of small world. Her mum actually taught me plant biology at Curtin. So that sort of built a really good rapport initially, and then a year later they actually sponsored me to come back to work with them again for 6 months and finish the wines that we created on their very first vintage, but also start to craft the wines that they wanted to create going forward for their second vintage.
Wow, that's so cool. It must have been so nice to, like you said, be part of all of it. Did you ever keep any of those wines kind of as a memento?
I did. Customs, as hard as they tried to take them off me, but I paid a little bit of duty and they came with me. I don't have any of those bottles left now, but the memories that they created in opening, particularly with my wife and family and friends, will probably die with me.
Yeah, that's so cool. I mean, especially in your early stages of your career, things like that can really, really cement whether you want to do something like that or move away from it. So that's really cool. Where else did you travel getting wine experience before you ended up back in WA?
So at the end of 2010 or start of 2010, I worked a couple of vintages back to back in Europe. So I worked for a guy called Francois Louton, who's a Bordeaux-based company who has who makes wine from different areas within France but around the world. His brother Jacques is another one that I think he was involved in the Kangaroo Island wine at some point in time. But Francois, I worked for him in Languedoc, so a lot of Sauvignon Blanc, Merlot and Shiraz. And then post that, I had an opportunity to go and work in the Mosel for Hayman Lowenstein. So that was a lot of vineyard work rather than winery work. The year that I went there in 2010 was one of the worst botrytis years that they had. It was a lot of hand sorting, a lot of hand picking within the vineyard, for an Australian guy to try and wrap his head around picking up fruit that sat on the ground, tasting it, understanding that needed to go into the bin compared to that needed to stay on the ground was a real solid learning experience for me. And the German supervisor spent a lot of time screaming at me in German, Polish, and very little English. So it was definitely an interesting time and something that I'll take to the grave with me. Reinhardt, the owner of Heyman Lowenstein, spent a lot of time with me talking about terroir and wine and how wine interacts over time and that sort of thing. And that's just stuff that money can't buy.
That's for sure. I was about to say what a shame that you had such a difficult kind of vintage, but then at the same time polarizing because you were looking, like you said, it was so different from every other experience you've had before. And I'm sure you got to taste some amazing wines out of their cellars too.
Oh, he was very generous in how he went about it, not only with some of his product, but from the Mosel in general. You know, like there's a lot to be learnt with how they were doing it at the time that I was over there, because it's not only people didn't own the entire terrace going up. There was, up the hill, they actually had terraces. So he spent a lot of time going, this is how we make our Riesling from this terrace. The guy below me makes his Riesling like this from that terrace. And then, you know, you might have had 2 or 3 producers in a very, very small area showcasing what they do. But the biggest takeaway from me is they all had this underlying pristine nature that only the ground could create.
Definitely a place that I think is probably one of the most resounding takeaways, I think, from any winemaker I've spoken to that's been in Germany. Other than that, and they're a bit fanatical, but they always talk about, you know, that transparency of Riesling.
Yeah, they're very, very passionate over there. And I think them taking their wines to the world, we're much better for it.
That's for sure. Tell me a little bit about how we come back to Australia and why we end up in Margaret River.
Well, initially coming back to Australia wasn't Margaret River, funnily enough. Winemaking is a very selfish game. Everything to do with wine in some way, shape or form is quite selfish. So we talk about my overseas vintages, but my wife didn't come across with me for any of them. So it was quite selfless of her allowing me to do that to progress my career. But at the same time, she needed to stay and be steady at home with mortgages and other bits and pieces that we already had in place. So when I returned, we actually created an environment where it was her turn to go and educate herself. So we moved to Melbourne for a year, and she went and did a makeup course with Napoleon, which was a sort of diploma from Tate in business and general makeup. And part of that, I was lucky enough to spend a year in the Yarra Valley with Steve Flamestead at Giant Steps.
Legend.
Absolute legend. And, you know, got the opportunity to not only sort of understand that you can make wine in an environment where everyone around you is a big part of that. You know, like Dave McIntosh was there for my vintage. So, you know, Dave is one of the most astute winemakers that I've seen in regard to what he actually sees and how he can make the changes as quickly as he does, on top of Flamo's expertise. And then I moved into the Tim Shand era at the back half of the year, and Shandy, whilst being amazingly astute, watching someone really dig so deep into finishing wines and getting an understanding of what needed to be created was just something to behold. And you know, like, I've got a utmost respect for those 3 guys and how they went about it in my time there.
So no, not such a bad thing when he kind of followed you back over to the West Coast.
Yeah, well, now he's got his challenges out at Voyager there, but I think, you know, Voyager's going to be in a much better place because he's involved. There's no doubt in my mind.
For sure. It's nice to hear you talk a little bit about your partner, and I often think with everybody, in relationships that where you've got two people doing, two very different jobs and trying to uphold careers and family, sometimes it does take these kind of moments or these blocks of time where someone has to be dedicated and the other person has to take a back seat and vice versa. So it's always good to hear that there is that to and fro, because I think it's very common in this day and age where someone's dedicated to doing one thing and the other person has to put things on hold.
Oh, 100%. Like, I can only talk from my side of things, but my family gives up a lot based on the passion that I have in wine. I think if you broke it down and spoke to anyone within business, that for 2 or 3 months of the year, you're basically not having a life and your family suffers, and you don't, there's a lot of love and forgiveness in what goes on, but they do give up a lot, and at some point in time you've got to give back to them, and hopefully I can achieve that in the other 9 months. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't, but the aim is, my family's my life first and foremost before I even think about anything else, and I think now the position that I'm in, there's a lot of work-life balance that hopefully creates the environment that's easier for my wife, myself and my daughter, and I get to see her grow up and partake in her life in her younger years, which is really important.
Absolutely it is. There is no bigger draw card, I think, to any job at the moment than an organisation that understands a little bit about work-life balance. So tell me a little bit about your experience in WA making wine and how, and tell us a story about how things have come full circle for you.
So, like, we live in a pretty magical place, as you know, with your visits over here. There's not too many places within Australia that has a climate like ours. It's affected by wholeheartedly 3 sides with ocean. Obviously, you got the Southern Ocean at the very, very bottom of Margaret River, and then the Indian Ocean on the west and the northern side that all have an influence. Some of the soils are some of the oldest in the country, and they vary quite a lot. So where I'm currently working at the moment at Aravina Estate, we've probably got a multitude of different soil types that interact with the varieties in different ways. And the fraternity, like, we've got a lot of very, very clever winemakers kicking around here, just in the area that I am within stone throws. You've got Julian Langworthy at Deepwoods and his 2 ICs, Emma and Matt Buchan, Todd Payne at Forrester. And then closer to the coast, you've got some real good family-run businesses in Windance and House of Cards that are organic and biodynamic, but the drive and push that these guys have to create the best wines that they can from a single vineyard is something that we look at as Aravina, myself and Ryan Agus, the chief winemaker, and not that we copy, but we really try and push to be as ecology sound as we possibly can to make the best wine we possibly can for the general consumer.
Now, you've got quite a number of hectares planted to vines out there at Aravina Estate. You've got kind of everything there. Is that one of the draw cards to working there? Because as soon as I had a little look, I thought you've got a restaurant, you've got a pizza bar. More importantly, you've got a tap house, 8 Waves Brewing. I thought, you know what? This makes a lot of sense that you're working here.
Yeah, our brewer, John Arnold, is probably the most loved man around Aravina, particularly coming into vintage. I'm sure that I hug him at the end of each working day as I've got a pint of his lovely crafted beer in my hand. But variety-wise, yeah, I think credit where credit's due. Ryan started here in 2015, and the previous owners were really supportive in having a look at non-traditional Margaret River varietals. So the main ones that we currently are looking at, and we seem to sort of are getting a better understanding of, Tempranillo, Grenache and Arinto. So we're the only producer of Arinto in Margaret River currently, so Portuguese white variety. And then sort of still keeping to the traditional varieties of Chardonnay, Cabernet, Sauvignon Blanc, Semillon. Chardonnay is the interesting one. We just grafted to 2 new clones for this site, so clone 3 and clone 5, which plays a big part in sort of Margaret River Chardonnay on top of Gin. So that gives us more opportunity to craft wines that better represent the site.
I think that's so great because what I love about kind of the range of Aravina is there's a real kind of freshness about all the wines, and you see that whereas you pick up the glass and you go, God, that's Chenin, or yep, that's Tempranillo immediately. And I think that they just kind of speak so truly of the varietals that they are. When you're making things like, Chenin that's been in the region for a long time, as opposed to something like Cabernet, is there a different approach?
Not necessarily. I think with this particular site, it was planted in '86 by a very knowledgeable South African called Albert Haak. So when you're talking Chenin, in particular, South Africa has been that sort of benchmark for it going forward. So when you've got a South African planting Chenin on a vineyard where he's done extensive soil testing, you hope to God he's gone to the right place to plant that Chenin. And in this case, I'm probably speaking out of turn a little bit, it's one of the best Chenin vineyards in WA, including sort of the Swan Valley and how we can create Chenin. So we've got one block of Chenin that has so much versatility. So we do a sparkling Chenin from it. We do a tank aged Chenin, and then obviously a wood aged Chenin. So there's 3 different styles of Chenin come off this one block, but it's all in the interaction with what the vines are telling you on any given year. So we've got 4 or 5 rows right in the middle of the block that go to our block 4 Chenin, which is wood aged. And that is the block and the vines telling us that's going to be what we need for that wine. And then everything else is sort of picked around that as we go.
That's so cool. I mean, Chenin can do anything, really. Anything you throw at it, it goes, yeah, sure, I can work with this. And I think it's so exciting to see that spread of the different approaches. And I think, your Aravina is really gaining a reputation for making some really exciting, I don't want to call them alternate, just varietals in summary. Tell me a little bit about why it's important to be involved in, the community around you. You're a member of the Margaret River Wine Show Committee. Why is it important to kind of, spend your time working with these kind of committees?
I suppose, my work allows me to go and judge in other areas, and I think that's a really important part of an educational phase for me, but also professionally. Like without wine show judging, I wouldn't be able to meet cool cats like yourself and Wolsey and Alice Davison from Tasmania. If we just stayed in our little corner of WA, you're just seeing the same people over and over again and not have the ability to have these conversations that can invoke thought. So having the ability to be able to do that, why not think, well, how about I try and give back to Margaret River by building the relationships to try and get these really astute judges across to try and give feedback to our constituents to become better. And that's the goal really at the end of the day, is all of us to become better and sort of lead not only wine in WA but wine in Australia internationally.
It's so true, isn't it? And I think that, sometimes it's not until you walk away from your little posse or your region or whatever and you just listen to what other people have to say that you sometimes get the honest truth. And I think that, like you said, it's when people know each other, it's often kind of what they want to hear, and everyone's trying to, stay friends. But when you kind of take yourself out of that, plop yourself down in another place, you overhear, bits and pieces, and you get a truer sense of kind of where people and their perspectives are at of what's happening in your region.
Oh, 100%. We've got some very, very clever winemakers over here that spend a lot of time and energy educating, particularly the younger guys coming up. But for me, if, I can sit down with Tom Carson at the Queensland Wine Show and listen to how he interacts and how he describes things and talks about Burgundy and other bits and pieces. Again, you can't buy that. That's just something that you gain as you go along. And if we continually gain year after year, we're going to become better for it.
Definitely. And tell me, if you were kind of to sum up, this is a big, hard question to answer, but if you're kind of to sum up what Aravina is all about and what excites you about that estate, how would you put that in terms of all the other brands that are coming out of WA or out of Margs?
It's really exciting being part of Aravina. Aravina has been so insular with how they've gone about it for so long. So they went from Amberley to Aravina in 2010 when they got the Tobins bought it. From that, Steve and Haley have done an amazing job in building a direct-to-consumer sort of platform for their wines. So up until the new ownership, very little Aravina wine was actually sold to wholesale. New owners have taken over, 18 months ago, and they've got a real thirst to present Aravina not only to Australia but to the world. And I think in an environment where things are being consolidated and these guys are looking to grow, it's a really exciting thing to be a part of, and they've got the capacity to sort of push this brand into the right areas going forward. And I think that alone, on top of what model they already had in place, I think business success and the availability for return on investment back into the business is a really exciting prospect to be part of.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell me, is there winemaking practices that you like to always abide by, or what do you think makes a great winemaker?
Cleanliness. as simple as that sounds, if you are clean, everything else should fall into place. We've got a wonderful estate here that the vines will basically showcase what the wines are meant to look like anyway. And, we bastardise the custodian thing quite a lot, but the reality for us is the more hands-off we are and what the vines create, the better we will look in the long run. And I think that's what's going to push this brand in particular forward, that vine age, site, not necessarily winemaking skill, that will be what will become definitive for Aravina, because it's got the pedigree. We know it's got the pedigree with the history of winning awards and that sort of thing. But for us, it's the site that's going to push what we need to create.
Well, that's always exciting. And I think that you really usually see winemakers or anyone involved in the land when their eyes light up when they start talking about a place, which I've seen very much so in you. You know that they really, really believe in what they're doing, and that makes me excited. So I think the Aravina is in really, really good hands. It's got a very bright future. I'm already addicted to the Tempranillo. I think it's delicious, but I'm excited to see what is to come. Tell me, if, all of this ended tomorrow and you had to go and do another job, what would be your one takeaway from the wine industry? What do you love the most about it?
That's a really good question. For me in particular, the biggest takeaway would be the camaraderie and the friends that I've made in the 20-odd years, and hopefully many more to make. For me, watching the enjoyment of someone come in and look at your wine, taste it, and the big smile that comes on their face is much more important than anything else. Industry recognition is a big part of what we do, but it's not the be-all and end-all.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, the tangible part about all this hard work that goes into being able to enjoy a glass with someone. And like you said, you've got all these great mates that you've made along the way that you like as people, but you're still able to trade a product at the end of the day and go, I know the person that made this and blood, sweat and tears went into it, And I think that's it's a unique part of the industry we're involved in, and it's certainly a special part.
100%.
All right, my final question for you, Mr. Kelly, is if you could only drink 3 beverages for the rest of your life, what would they be and why?
Well, the first one's probably pretty obvious. If you know me, beer is a big part of my life. It makes me survive through vintage. I'm not going to name brands, but 8 Waves is a big part of my life at the moment, and John does an amazing job. So whenever you get the chance to come to Aravina, try some of his hardwares, because they're all his different beers are amazing. The second one is probably a really good theme at this time of year, is champagne. If I went a specific house, Rota is a big part of mine and my wife's life. Every wedding anniversary, we generally crack a bottle. And funnily enough, it was my parents' 50th wedding anniversary. It was about 4 or 5 days ago. And we got them a bottle of Cristal. Being a golden wedding anniversary, Cristal seemed to fit the bill quite often, with one pretense that the bottle was empty by the time we left their house, and luckily enough we got to partake in that, which is great. And the last one is a Negroni or whiskey sour. I think if you can get really top quality vermouth into a Negroni, there is nothing better.
That very much tells me lots about you, and I agree. The vermouth does have a big part to play, and can take what can be a pretty, easy drink into something that's really detailed and delicious and complex. And 3 fantastic drinks. No wonder we get along. Trent, it's been such a delight to have you on the podcast. I hope we do get to do some judging or get to see each other. You know me, I'm a total... I can't say that word that I was thinking, but I am just terrible for Margaret River. If I can get over there, I will do it for, any sin possible. So I hope we do get to chat again soon. And thank you for your time today. Best of luck with vintage.
Awesome. Thank you very much for having me, Shanteh. Greatly appreciate it.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, Trent. Cheers to you.
See you. Bye.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Stay tuned for more stories from the world of wine and drinks. Listen in every Thursday on your podcast app. Follow us on Instagram at overaglasspod and contact us at overaglass@deepintheweeds.com.au.